Hey, good morning. Thank you very much for joining me in this video. I want to talk to you this morning about private deals. Seems strange, I know. We're in the business of trading in real estate, so we want to earn a commission. We don't deal with private transactions, but sometimes we do. And it's important that we understand the liability and the process before we go down that path. Let's suppose you got a friend that comes to you and says, I'm selling this property, the property that I own, to a friend of mine. And we don't really know how to go about it, and we know you do. Would you mind writing up the paperwork for us? Don't want to pay a commission, not looking at listing it, just wonder if you'd help me out with the paperwork. And you say, sure, you're a friend of mine, I'd be happy to do that. Well, be careful. Understand that it's a private deal between A and B, but the fact that you're writing up the deal and the fact that you are the expert, you're the realtor, there is obligation and there is liability. What I want you to imagine is, let's suppose sometime before closing, the deal goes south. There's a problem. They fight over something, something comes up in title, something comes up in financing, and all of a sudden they're at each other's throats instead of a smooth deal. Immediately it's going to be, well, the realtor wrote up the offer, he should have looked after this, he should have done that, and you're dragged into the middle of it. And you will be. The fact that you're not being paid doesn't even enter into it. Way back 30 years ago, when we were under sub-agency, it did. Back then they said the person who pays is the person who's the agent and so on. But that's not the case any longer. So you've got an obligation whether you want to or not. And the fact that you're probably going to use an ARIA form compounds it a little bit. So one of the things you're going to have to do is you're going to have to deal with agency. You're going to have to make sure it's clear with each party that they understand the principles of agency and they understand that you're being a facilitator, you're not representing one or the other of them, or that they're customer, not client. You have to go down that road. You're also going to have to deal with the potential that if it goes south, somebody can complain to RICO, RICO's going to come down and they're going to want to see a file. So you need to probably open a file, and I would advise you when it comes to the deposit, don't have the deposit being held by the seller. Seller spends it, there's a problem, the buyer wants his money back, the seller's not prepared to give it back, and you wrote up the offer. Have it held by one of the lawyers is best, or have it held by the real estate company. No problem there. You don't have to charge a commission to do that, but it's really helpful to have a file if RICO gets involved to make sure that you followed everything you've done. But the key things you need to look after is you need to look after a full understanding by all the parties about agency and also how you handle that deposit. Okay, let's go on to a second thing. Let's suppose you want to sell your own property privately. Can you do that when you're a realtor? Yes, you can. You are entitled to sell a property privately, whether you're licensed or not. But don't go down that road under normal circumstances. I think it looks terrible in the industry if a real estate agent is selling privately. How can your peers go out and encourage private for sale by owners to list their property when one of your own is selling privately? So don't do that. Just charge no commission on the listing end of it and do it exclusively if you want, but don't do it privately. But let me tell you a story because it illustrates what can happen. Back when I had my Burlington office, one of the agents there had purchased a house from people who were moving down to the States. So they moved in, they were quite happy, loved the house. A couple of years later, there's a knock on the door, they open the door, and here's the person they bought the house from. And the person says, you know, we've been transferred back, and we'd really like to buy our old house back. Would you consider selling it? Well, the lady and her husband talked about it and mulled their idea over for a while and said, yeah, we'd sell it. And so they sold it back to the original seller. Well, they didn't do any thing through the office. They didn't do any specific paperwork. And somehow or other, I don't know how to this day, but somehow or other, RICO got involved, heard about it, and contacted us and wanted to see the file. I didn't know anything about it. They just done it privately, which they're allowed to do. But RICO said, no, because you're a real estate agent, there has to be a file kept in the office because we want to make sure that you did disclosure as a registrant disposing of a property. And we want to make sure that you covered agency issues. And so they said we had to have a file in the office, even if you're selling privately. We hadn't run across that before. Tuck that in the back of your mind. It may come up similar to the situation I just cited, where all of a sudden it falls into your lap And you have to make sure that you handle disclosure, and you have to make sure that you've dealt with agency. Let me deal with the third one now. And I run into people who are just coming into the business, and I will do an interview with them, and I ask them what prompted them to get into real estate. And I used to do that when I was teaching the real estate course. And it's amazing how often you'll get somebody that says, well, I buy and fix and flip, or I buy and invest, and I figured if I'm going to do that, I might better get a hold of my real estate license and save the commission. Not necessarily. You'll save the commission, but you create a lot more obligation on your part. There's a much higher standard you're held to as a real estate agent than a member of the general public. Let me give you another personal example, if you don't mind. One of my agents came to me one day and said, I got a problem. I'm listing a property. I've been contacted by the sellers. It's an estate. But they've got a kind of a wingnut relative down in the U.S. who is just a control freak and really a problem. And they don't want him to find out anything about the process. He isn't part of the signing authority for the estate. It's got nothing to do with him. But if he gets wind of it, it's going to be terrible. So we don't want you to list it on MLS. We don't want you to advertise it. We want you to talk it up and find a buyer. So he said, what am I going to do? I said, well, let me have a look at it. So we drove to the property, and I thought, you know what? It's a mess. It's just a ton of work that needs to be done, but it's in the North End location, and it would be nice eventually as a rental property. So I agreed to buy it. It was no deal. It was market value, and I wrote up the agreement of purchase and sale, and it was accepted. And then somewhere along the process, I don't remember whether it was after closing or before, but I think it was probably after closing, and I'm doing major renovation. There's a lot of work that has to be done. This relative gets wind of it, and he starts a hate campaign, sending emails to the people who had signing authority, to the people who were going to inherit the money, to the agent who had the kind of listing, and then to me. Finally, he sent a complaint in to RICO, and RICO came down to see me. Well, we showed them that we had done the disclosure. We had done issues about agency. We had all our paperwork in order. No problem there. But then RICO started to zero in on what I paid for it. And they wanted to make sure I didn't get a deal. Well, normally I wouldn't have done this, but because this thing had so much work that required that I took pictures before and I took pictures after, and because it was a rental property, I had all my receipts. I showed them and then proved to them that the market value, now that it was fixed up, was less than the money I had into it. That's why I couldn't do fix and flips. I spent too much money. And so I was able to solve those issues. And I remember the investigator from RICO saying, well, why didn't you do the work yourself? I said, well, because I'm in the business of running a real estate firm, not doing renovations, and so it cost me more money. So this wasn't done to make money, but what if it was? And here's where you got to be careful. You're getting a call, and somebody wants you to list their property. You go knock on the door, you go in the property, you have a look around, and you fall in love with the property. You think, I'd really like to buy this myself. Maybe you want to live in it, maybe you want to rent it, it doesn't really matter. You want to buy it. You've got some challenges ahead. The biggest challenge is price. How are you going to set price? Because buyers naturally, if they can, want to get a good deal. Sellers, obviously, want to get market value or more. And so you're caught in that. The first thing I would say to you is, don't list it. Creates another layer of liability. But you're going to have to establish price. Now, if you're Joe Blow off the street and you walk in there and you can offer them $100,000 less than it's worth, or maybe they're unastute and they quote a figure that's $100,000 less than it's worth. Joe Blow off the street can cut them a check and buy the property. You can't. You've got an obligation. Now, it's possible that you can buy it below market value, and certainly people who advertise, you know, I'll sell your house, if I don't sell it, I'll buy it myself, they always pay far less than the market value, and they demonstrate, well, here's the market value, and I'm going to depreciate it by holding and carrying costs and closing costs and commission and all this kind of stuff, and they come up with a price, but they start with what is the market value. And if you are buying it yourself, you've got to have some way to establish market value. And if you're paying less than market value, then you need to state to the seller, and the seller needs to acknowledge that they know it's actually worth this, and you're only paying this, and they're okay with that. You've got an obligation because you're the expert, and it's too easy in Rico's eyes, and in our eyes too. It's too easy for you to walk in and quote a low figure to an unastute seller and buy it and take advantage of them. And you can't afford to do that. But if you're buying it privately, that doesn't alleviate the responsibility for you to do disclosure that you're a registrant acquiring a property and to cover agency, and of course this whole issue of price and how you handle that. So be very, very careful if you're a licensed realtor and you're somehow involved in a private deal, whether you're facilitating it for two people, or whether you're selling your own property, or whether you're buying your own property. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video. I'll talk to you again next week.